Okay, so I've got my model here that I've been showing you in the earlier videos on the adaptive reuse project. I better go to a 3D view of the outside so you can see I do have the whole building form modelled up. I still need to put in the site and the adjoining buildings, but it's at a point where I can start thinking about putting in some extra detail. So I'm just going to delete some things that I made earlier because I want to show you some of those again. And so I want to go over your modelling options for families, because for your own design elements you'll obviously need to model lots of things of your own, and maybe point out the two main methods you have for making families in Revit, using either model in place, which you get to under component on the architecture tab. The down arrow there gives you the option to model in place. On the main menu, the other alternative is to go to new and then family. So you have those two main options for making families in Revit, and you need to think long and hard about the best method for the object you're making. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. Going into the plan view that I have here, you can see I've got this bar that I want to have this unusual shape that also relates to things in my space. So it relates to the column and other things that are drawn in this interior. So that's a good example of something that will be made, or should be made, using model in place, just like the example you can see that comes up there, that table that wraps around the column, because then I can model it with respect to things in my project. Maybe I'll just point out some other things. I'm going to do some of these tables and chairs, and so because they're repeated elements that are going to be more easily adjusted in a separate file, they'd be an example of something you should make as a separate family in their own files using a new family file from the menu, which I'll give you an example of afterwards. Either way, you're going to have the same tools to model what you need. So the first example, like I said, I'll give you is using model in place under component, where you can choose a category. And if you're not that familiar with the Revit categories, for furniture, you obviously have the furniture category, but if it's built-in furniture, I'd recommend you use casework as your category instead, because furniture is a special category that won't show cut in your sections for a good reason. I don't know if you've thought about the way chairs and tables should show up in your section views. You wouldn't want them to be cut normally. So chairs like this, if they're cut in your section, it's going to show too much detail. You just want them to show up in elevation or with the lighter lines always. So that's why furniture's set to show that way. Casework, on the other hand, will cut. So in your section you'll see a nice cut through your elements. So I'll use that category for my bar, and I'll call it counter or bar. That's fine. And or maybe it's going to be the candy bar, really, so that's what I'll call it, candy bar. And okay, so then I have the modelling, solid modelling tools you expect to have normally in Revit: extrusion, blend, revolve, sweep, and swept blend, which will let you do most of the forms you need. And extrusions will probably be the most common one that you need to use. You use them for all sorts of things, and I'll just give you some simple examples making an extrusion. You can see then it gives you all the options for shapes, and you don't get all of these for some of the other tools. With walls, for example, you don't get splines. So to make a spline type shape, even when you're making a wall, this can be a good approach. And I'm going to do a spline here just to show you something different. So clicking on the spline tool, I'll then go to trace my drawing and put in a few control points. So I know you might be looking at these forms if you're going for a more fluid or organic model. splines are sometimes the only way to make those things. Notice I'm tracing it pretty roughly, because I know I've already done this before, that I've made this with a spline in AutoCAD. If you're thinking, why wouldn't I use pick lines? It won't let me pick those, because, again, splines work a bit differently in Revit. Okay, so I can't just pick those lines to get a spline. I have to trace it using the spline tool, and then I can come back afterwards and adjust the control points to get it to follow that shape as best I can. Okay, so think long and hard about the options you have for splines in Revit, because it's not as good at this sort of modelling as other programs, but you can get it to do basically what you want most of the time. So here it's not exactly following the shape I did in AutoCAD, but close enough to the work we're doing here. Now notice with splines you'll get the options to add and delete control points, which can be helpful. So here I can add in an extra control. Oops, let's just try that again. So here add control, and I can click on the edge there to get more detail in that spline if I need it. Okay, so another couple of little things with splines that can be tricky. If you try to adjust the endpoints, it changes the way that shape's defined. So again, it can seem a bit strange at first, just one of those things you have to experiment with. Also, if you offset a spline in Revit, it's a bit different to AutoCAD, so I'll use offset here, and I know that width there is 500, so I'll put that in. And then I can choose the spline and let me offset, but now if I choose that new spline, notice it doesn't have the control points. Okay, so I can stretch those endpoints, but again that's going to give me a different shape, so I'm not going to do that. I'll undo that, and instead I'm just going to close this shape. Sometimes half the battle in Revit is getting the initial form that you want. So I'll close these shapes off, and that's the main requirement. When you're making an extrusion, it just has to be a closed shape. And I'll then also check my depth, so I'm going to make this 1200, and tick to finish. That'll make my solid. So I'll have a look at it in the 3D view that I've already made, and you can see there's my form. You can always select that and change the height. I might try a metre instead. That's a bit high for this kind of bar. So there we go. That looks a bit better. So I've got the basic form, but as you saw in the plan, the way I've done it in AutoCAD, where I can work things out a bit better, splines and those unusual forms can be a bit easier to work with in AutoCAD. I worked out that it really should follow the edge here coming around. So instead of trying to do that in the extrusion, think about how you can modify things after you made them by using voids. So with the void extrusion there, I can simply draw in a shape that will cut that part off. Tick to finish, and if it's overlapping, it'll automatically cut that solid. So I'll do another one here. Again, void forms, and notice you get all the same options you do for solids. So just void extrusion though is all I'm using, and coming back here, so we've got a passage all the way for the staff to get through that's the same width. Again, tick to finish, and it will cut. So it doesn't need to be perfect the first time you make your form, as long as you get the surfaces you want. If there are extra things, you can always try and take those away using voids. And so then I've got this shelving unit, which I'm going to make a tapering form. So maybe to give you an example of a tapering form, I'll use a blend instead of an extrusion. And so with a blend, you have the same options as you do for an extrusion. I'll draw the base first, just here with straight lines. Notice I'm making it a bit bigger than that initial rectangle because I do want it to be tapering. Something like that will do. And then the difference between a blend and an extrusion is that you have also a top profile. So here, once you go to edit top, I'll then go and draw a second rectangle, again a bit smaller than the one I did in AutoCAD this time. Fairly rough, I'm not going to be too worried if it's not exactly the right size here. Okay, and then you have to think about the height as well. So I'll make this fairly high, about 2 metres for now. And so it's going to blend from this outer rectangle to the inner one. I'll even go into a different view so you can see it without the AutoCAD line work. So we've just got the two shapes there. And maybe I'll adjust that back so that it's a bit more even. That's close enough. Okay, so that will taper. If I finish that now, then in the perspective view again, you'll see I've got this tapering form. That's a simple way to make a tapered object. And I can change the height still, so I'll make that maybe 3 metres, which will simply take the top profile up higher. Okay, so lots of different ways of making forms. If I wanted shelving to go into that, now I could go back into plan, and so you might be thinking that you wanted to have a look at this from the side if you're going to do shelving, and that's definitely possible, but to give you some maybe tricks in Revit, you can't make a section view while you're in family mode, so in model in place. So I've got to finish the model first, then I can make a section view, which is just going to cut through that part of the bar and look at the shelving unit. Now I can go and open the section up, select my in-place family I've made, go to edit in place, and then create some void extrusions here. But it'll ask me to pick a plane to draw on. How do I know where the plane's going to be? Well, you could choose the surface of that object, but remember that's sloping. So again, I've got to go out of the family, I'll cancel that, back into the plan view, and a really good trick I've worked out in Revit is to draw a reference plane that follows the angle of the section. Now notice it won't snap to that. You can see there it's not going to follow that section line exactly. It might look like it's close, but it's not at exactly the angle of the section. So what do? Delete the section, that's fine. Make the reference plane first. So here I'm going to trace the edge of this shape because that's the angle I want my shelving to follow. So I've drawn my reference plane, and you might remember this if you did earlier subjects with Revit, drawing a reference plane and then in properties giving them a name. So I can call this shelving plane, will do. And you'll notice in the view, once you've given a reference plane a name, you should see it in the view as well, which can really help when you're going to select them in other views. And now, if I go and make a section, it'll snap to that reference plane. Another trick there, nudge it away so that it's looking towards that section, sorry, towards the reference. Double click on the section arrow to open the view, and now I can select my family, edit in place, and make my void extrusions. And this time, when it asks me to select a plane, I can simply go to the list there and choose the one that I've given a name to, shelving plane. That's a really important concept in Revit. You're limited to modelling solid forms, which are generally based on 2D shapes, and so you need to be able to think about the plane and set the plane that defines that 2D shape. So clicking OK, now I can draw some, I'll just do rectangles for now to get it, to give me some simple shelving shapes. We can follow the angle of the taper later, just to give you the basic idea. So that's my void shape. Maybe I'll get it to come down below the slab up there. Bring the others down a bit. Will do. Okay, so pretty rough shelving it for the moment, but I'll just make it a little bit neater so that it does have similar thicknesses. I'm sure you can all draw rectangles though. So I'm not going to even worry too much about the depth here. I'll finish that. And I'm going to go into one of my other 3D views which I should have to show me the interior. So notice I've got these section box views that have different parts of the building cut away to make it easier for me to work on my interior elements. So you're doing interior design, you need to think about how you're going to get into the interior in Revit. And I'll stretch this now so that it goes through that unit I've made. So looking at that all the way around, you can see it goes through that solid I made earlier. Click to one side and then you can see there it is cutting through the unit. Right, so I'll finish that model. And like I said, that's an example of an in-place family. I'll probably change it a little bit later, but just again give you an example. So back into the plan view that I have, I'll go to the one with the drawing, and you'll see these seating and other units. And so again, they're repeated elements that should be identical when they're copied throughout the project. So that's an example of something you should make as a separate family file. On my menu, new family. Think about the category you use, and if you haven't done massing before, avoid the grey ones. These here, the ones that are grey, they're adaptive components which use the massing interface, which if you haven't used before, I wouldn't be trying to learn at this stage. So all of the others though you can use. And if you're not sure which one to use, generic models is always a good one. Metric generic model. In this case, I know that I'm making furniture. And like I said before, furniture won't show cut in your section, so it's a good category for these tables and chairs, metric furniture. Right, so I'm going to make a stool, because you saw I had quite a few of those, and that's a good example of something you can make with a revolve. So with the elevation views, you see from the side, and then if I go to make a revolve there, I'll just do a profile view from the side, so we'll come up about 400 or so, should be about right. Stool heights do vary quite a bit, but that's not bad. So then coming across, this is easy to adjust, I'll just do this fairly roughly for now. So I'm doing the whole thing in one. We can break it up into separate elements later. So hopefully you're pretty good at drawing lines in Revit. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, except to set the scale. I'm going to go down to a lower scale like 1 to 5, which will give me lighter line work. It's a really bad habit people go into setting thin lines all the time. You can do that, but it's just going to take that line weight away, which I think is harder to see. So okay, so then here I want to have a rounded edge there, so I'll delete that line and put an arc on instead. Right, so that's the profile of my stool shape. I'll maybe bring that out a little bit. And then you might have noticed I was drawing boundary lines to get the initial shape. Now I'll go to axis line up on the ribbon there and simply draw that through the centre of the profile, or where the centre of the revolve will be. So that's what it's going to revolve around. Tick to finish, and there we are in 3D. You see my basic stool shape. Again, it's got heavy line work because of the scale. So back to 1 to 20 or something, and you'll see it with finer lines. In a shaded view, we'll get an idea how it looks. So that's a basic stool. The post there is maybe a bit too thick, so it's a simple thing to go into the elevation view where I made it. After it's selected, edit revolve, and you can adjust the lines. I'll use the arrow here just to bring that across to the left. I'll bring this one across as well. That'll give me a thinner leg, essentially. Okay, so then I'll save that now as its own file. Save as family, and I'll just save it here, that's fine. So I know those modelling tools, if you haven't used them a lot, do take a bit of getting used to, but the main thing is that you at least at first think about how you're going to start making them, whether it should be a separate file like this one or made in place in your project. Okay, so having made this separate file that I've saved, now I can click Load into Project, tick the one that I have open, which I've called Hub 7A, and then I can start placing these in any view. Okay, so I've got some stools here. It's a component, so an architecture component, and then I can start putting them in. By eye for now, okay. I'll do an array later, but for now that's fine just to place them roughly. Okay, so I've got those different objects there, and again, just to maybe make that concept a bit clearer, if I want to change those, I can select one, choose Edit Family on the ribbon. It'll take me back to the family file, and I can make a change. So maybe I'll again select it, Edit Revolve. It's a bit hard to work with here, so I'll go into the elevation and bring that base across a bit just to make a simple change. There we go. Tick to finish. Look at it in 3D. Bit small maybe, but that'll do for now. So I'll save that just so you can see the change being made. Load it back into the project. And just keep an eye on these. If I go to either option here, it doesn't really matter which one you choose if you haven't set parameters. I'll still just choose the second option, and you'll see that the legs of all of those will change. So the idea there is that you're globally managing these families. The counter that I did earlier is a one-off. So that's a unique element, and to manage that globally now is much more difficult. So again, anything that's repeated, like these furniture elements, think about making them as separate families. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show you with families. The other modelling tools, you can have a look at any of my other videos on YouTube on modelling, and I've got examples of all those different modelling options. But again, it's really important to just think about the management at this stage. And well, I'll just leave that video there, but on YouTube, don't forget, you have plenty of other videos if you want to go further with modelling. So the one here, Museum of the Senses 18, has a lot of different solid modelling techniques that I haven't showed you tonight, if you're interested in that. And then number 20 has even more solid modelling techniques. So lots of different examples you can look at there. And then going even further for stairs, I've got 2 videos as well which will go further with stairs than you might have earlier. So number 17 and number 19 for the Museum of the Senses as well. So have a look at those when you have time. I'll just finish that video there.